So let me start with submission that when I talk about this, trying to talk about this thing, women as political issue, having many dimensions. So I'll be actually limiting my discussion with some points and critical points in this discussion, in this the kind of discussion political participation of women. And when I talk about women as constituency, I don't mean women in, of course, I don't mean women in homogeneous terms, because they are divided socially, politically, economically, culturally. So when women emerge as a constituency, they are divided, and that actually is a very interesting dimension of this politicking, and of course these constituency politics. That is the first thing I would like to start with. And when I talk about women as political constituency, I also would like to talk about women as and women as the representatives as well. That means the elected leaders. And this is, once again, this is a very vast field, but I would like to be limited to the gender gap in the policy making platforms, and a very general picture that's emerging in terms of gender profile legislative bodies, parliaments, etc. And women's, particularly women's role in the legislative politics as being a constituency, the prospect of women as constituency, and within that prospect of constituency, women's different roles as members, as leaders, etc. And that when I talk about, we talk about political constituency, this is very difficult, particularly in terms of gender politics. It's very difficult to segregate between social, economic, political, cultural movements, struggles. But still, I would like to make a categorical segregation in terms of this social, political, economic, and uh, we all know that how the social movements, particularly socio-economic movements, that have actually created a larger scope for the uh, promises of women as political constituencies. So it's not that the social movements only preceding the political empowerment movements, but it goes hand in hand as well. But the history actually spells about the larger trend of social economic movements promising into a political constituency, in the promises of political constituency. So these are some of the very preliminary points I would like to discuss and reflect upon, and of course, as my part of my understanding. Now,
Next station, Upsi Hoga. Doors will open on the left. Tarvati station, Upsi Hoga.
franchise politics of franchise, suffrage politics, because this is a core part of this debate, the women's role as political citizen. So I would like to focus my discussion on the franchise politics, politics of franchise, the suffrage movement, particularly the suffrage movement. Now, when we talk about women as political constituency, it actually gained prominence largely from the demands of the suffrage movement, and which was, as I have already mentioned, which was largely preceded by the struggles for basic civil rights, economic rights, for property, for education, for social status, etc. Now, the centrality of the agenda of the right to equal political participation within the very broader socio-cultural struggle for gender equality, however, did not imply a very fundamental challenge to the public-private divide uh, in the early years of this suffrage politics, suffrage movement. Uh, and it is clear from the documents of the debates, of the speeches, of the convention proceedings of the women suffrage movements, that feminine stereotypes and cultural tropes uh, persisted very strongly uh, even within the suffragists, the ambit of suffrage movement, despite their liberatory promises and despite their claim to public power. Nonetheless, the transformative potential of the suffrage movement in challenging this divide, the public and private divide, actually set the ground for a critical journey towards the political empowerment in making women a political constituency. And it has to be reckoned with the democratic, participatory politics. Now, this journey, we all know that this journey was not a very easy struggle, easy road, and it was actually impregnated with the gendered apprehensions about female role, about female leadership, their capabilities, their power, etc. And it is also marked by the inherent conflicts of the feminist movements. Still, it is worthy to go back. I think it is very important to go back to the history of the suffrage movement uh, to understand the nuances uh, of women's demands as political citizen. And it is very uh, relevant even today, particularly becoming more relevant in some coming in the 21st century as well. Now, for this discussion, I would like to shed light on uh, the two very important citadels of liberal democracy, UK and USA. And these two were also the two important epicenters, these two countries were two important epicenters of women's suffrage movement, right to equal uh, franchise. I would like to begin with USA and then I'll move on to UK. আমরা হয়তো অনেকেই সবাই জানি, হয়তো সেই অর্থে কিছুটা রিপিটেশন হচ্ছে। জাস্ট আমার আমার নিজের মনে হয় যে এই সাফ্রেজ মুভমেন্ট, ওমেন সাফ্রেজ এর ইতিহাস, তার যে আর্কাইভিং, সাধারণভাবে ফেমিনিস্ট মুভমেন্টের আর্কাইভিংয়ে সেটা একটা হিস্টোরিক্যাল ফেজ হিসাবে যতটা দেখা হয়, একটা বর্তমান পরিস্থিতিতে সাফ্রেজ মুভমেন্টের যে গুরুত্ব বা যে critical position সেটার হয়তো কিছুটা অভাব আছে. So I would like to go back to the suffrage movement of the 19th century, the late 19th century.
Please stand away.
I think we all have heard the name of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Stanton was Elizabeth was a staunch supporter of the suffrage movement, suffrage rights, and she was a leading social activist and particularly a very well-known face of the anti-slavery movement in the USA in the second half of the 19th century. Now, Elizabeth was married to Henry Stanton, and in the year 1840,
Next
when
station.
she was traveling to London, went to London with
Terminates.
her husband Henry
Doors will open on
to
the right.
enjoy her honeymoon over there.
Belongs.
At that time, in 1840, in London, the World Anti-Slavery Convention was being held, and Elizabeth was there. Another very famous activist, female activist of the USA, Lucretia Mott was also there. They met there in London. The interesting thing was that though women take a very, very significant part in the anti-slavery movement, they were not invited in the convention. So Elizabeth and Lucretia, they were very agitated. They came back to USA and decided to hold a women's rights convention on their own effort. And after a lot of battle, they could organize the Women's Right Convention in 1848 uh, at Seneca Falls in New York. I think many of us know about this convention, the landmark convention in the suffrage movement, the Seneca Falls Convention. And this convention was also important in the sense that this was the beginning of a formal organizational effort to for women's suffrage, along with other social and economic struggles. Elizabeth was very passionate about this movement, this convention, so she penned down the Declaration of Sentiments. She herself penned down the Declaration of Sentiments, and it was a very interesting parallel uh, to the Declaration of Independence by the US founding forefathers. Now, the Declaration of Sentiments, in that declaration, Elizabeth wrote in a very harsh, strong terms that the history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and interruptions on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. The Seneca Falls actually was based on the prospective movements. It was actually organizing the prospective movements for women's rights. And they adopted 12 resolutions. And one of these resolutions was right to political participation. It was mentioned there that resolved that it is the duty of the women of this country to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective elective franchise. So uh, this Seneca Falls actually convention actually took the note of the patriarchy and the exclusion of women from the public sphere. And uh, influenced by the spirit of Seneca Falls Convention, in 1850, the Waiho Women's Convention was held, and it demanded the right to vote more emphatically and define democracy in a more meaningful way in terms of equal rights, share of rights, and equal share of privileges of government, irrespective of sex and color. This is a very important point in the early suffrage, from the very beginning of the early suffrage movement. Uh, that's why we find a uh, focus on the diversity, because not only the women were deprived of their public right to public power, but the men of colors were also the victims. So it was kind of a broader struggle for irrespective of sex and color. Now, in this convention uh, declared uh, that though the politician may sneer at us because we wish to have our rights acknowledged, our right to share in the government too, as full an extent as it does, because we object longer to endure taxation without representation, because we desire to have a form of government instituted which shall derive its power from the consent of the government. Let us not be removed from our position. This is the WIHO Convention was very emphatic about these two important dimensions. One is that women were already taking part in economic affairs. They were part, though the upper class women actually were mostly taking part in this taxation economy. Uh, and also, this is number one, the economic power right of the woman. And the second important was the very word consent of the government. So this was the very fundamental liberal credo that was denied by the liberal governments to the women. So Women's Convention, WIHO Convention, actually pointed out this uh, discrimination. But what we actually saw was from the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, it took almost 72 years to pass the franchise right, the equal franchise right for women by the US Constitution. It was, you all know, 19th Amendment of US Constitution in 1980, 1918 সালে এই নারীরা আমেরিকাতে ভোটাধিকার পেল। So throughout the last decades of the 19th century and early 20th century, women fought for the shorter working hours. That was their economic struggles: shorter working hours, better pay at workplace, uh, the better working conditions, and right to vote in the USA, in UK, in other European countries. So these movements were actually preparing the ground for political empowerment of women and intersections of sex, color, race, class, etc., were visibly gaining criticality in the struggle for suffrage from the very beginning. Uh, I come to UK. Throughout the 18th, 19th century, a prominent section of the British liberals propagated the uh, universal suffrage and equal rights for women. We all have read about John Stuart Mill and others, and they actually criticized the common apprehensions of women as weaker, women as dependent, women lacking education and reason to take part in public uh, debates. They were confronted by the apprehensions of a dominant section of the British political leaders, British liberals, a large section of the liberals, both men and also women, unfortunately. They were apprehensive. These conservative sections, though belonging to the British liberal uh, regime in general, they were very apprehensive about the changing demographic profile of the parliament, of the legislature, if women were granted the suffrage right, the right to vote. If it was allowed, the changing demographic profile of the parliament, they were apprehensive of. And I think we can make a comparison, uh, take a note of the same apprehension uh, shared by a section of the male Indian parliamentarians, even in 21st century, throughout the last half of 20th century, last 2 decades of 20th century and 21st century, during the women's reservation debates. We all have seen how uh, these apprehensions were raised uh, over and over again. ভারতবর্ষের পার্লামেন্টের বিতর্কে পুরুষ পার্লামেন্টারিয়ানরা সদস্যরা বারবার তাদের এই শঙ্কা যে ভারতের পার্লামেন্টের সংসদের চেহারাটা যে পাল্টে যেতে পারে নারীরা যদি ভোটাধিকারের ক্ষেত্রে একটা কোটা পায়, রিজার্ভেশন সংরক্ষণ পায়, সেটার সম্পর্কিত শঙ্কা আমরা বারবার দেখেছি. সো ইট ইজ নট দ্যাট ইন 19th century, but even in 21st century. Now, despite resistance of the British liberal conservatives and also the liberals, the women's suffrage movement gained momentum. And very
इंटरनेट शेष हो गया
social resources. So the kind of British women who came on the streets, they also the demanding functions. They were also incorporating the demands of different sections of women, but particularly the appearance of or the dominance of the upper and middle class women in the early part of the suffrage movement was gradually beginning to incorporate the working women's, particularly the lower class women's uh, interests as well or demands as well, because already there were uh, huge movements in factories, the trade union movements where women were gaining their strength. So, economic struggle and political battle for right to vote were merged together, and that actually expanded the scope of women's uh, as political constituents. Now, it was no denying that there were internal tensions between the suffragists along social, cultural, and economic lines. There were differences, divisions between the radicals, socialists, liberals. There were differences. Uh, I think we can give example of the very famous family of 19th century England of women's rights movement, the Pankhurst family. আমরা অনেকেই এদের নাম জানি, Emmeline and her daughters, Sylvia and Christabel. They had a very interesting family uh, conflict, ideological was reflected in the greater suffrage movement as well. But it also reflected the nuances of the right of women as political constituents. Now, the British woman got the right first in 1918, a limited kind of right, uh, because the very important criteria was property along with age, and then got the full right in 1928 only. Now, I would not like to add other countries, European countries, liberal countries of that time, because তাতে আমার আলোচনার পরিধিটা আরো দীর্ঘায়িত হয়ে যাবে। বিকজ এই দুটোর ওপরে আমি বলতে চাইলাম এই কারণে, কারণ এই দুটি কান্ট্রি আমাদের অনেক ক্ষেত্রে পথ দেখিয়েছে এবং বিশেষত সাফরেজ মুভমেন্টের জন্মস্থান হিসেবে আমাদের পথ দেখিয়েছে। Now, the suffrage politics opened up as I was talking about the nuances of the movements. It was not, of course, a linear trend. The suffrage politics was impregnated with uh, the very question of identity from the very beginning. So, identity politics, it plays a very important role, and we may say that historically the movements around women's rights to economic, social, and also the political participation that firstly originated as the demands for greater access, ownership, or entitlements. But for each of these movements, it is very interesting to note that how identity cuts across the scope of these movements, and we would like to talk about this for women's suffrage movement, how over and over again identity politics has become a very crucial factor in the suffrage politics or suffrage movements, and that actually represents the very shadowy
Yeah,
parts,
left right.
features of
Yeah.
politicking of gender rights. Now, for example, in the late 19th, early 20th century, privileging class struggle over suffrage rights became one of the central contentions of the left socialist movements in different countries of the Europe. Today we are celebrating International Working Women's Day, and that actually brings in the very question of class uh, within the broader scope of women's rights, women's politics. Uh, the anti-clerical movements in France, in Germany, in Italy, uh, that were also very apprehensive about that. That was a progressive movement, anti-clerical movements. But these were also very apprehensive about the suffrage rights of women, fearing the religious influence of the Vatican over the Catholic women voters. They were very apprehensive about if the women get the right to vote, then how the Vatican would actually control them. Women as religious believer, the apprehension about that. In some other countries, women suffrage issues were settled in a secondary position vis-a-vis the nationalist movements, the national liberation movements, the movements for right to self-determination. The women question was not a core part of the grand narrative of nationalist agenda or ideology. For example, the women in, for example, women in Ireland, women took a very significant part in the Irish nationalist movement from the beginning. The Easter Rising in 1916, uh, that was held with the promise of representative governments and based on equal franchise rights in a free Ireland. If the for all men and women equal franchise rights in free Ireland, that was the promise of the uprising. And in 1922, when Ireland set the constitution, constitutional goals, and that constitution reduced the role of Irish women to a Catholic ideal of domesticity. So, restricting women's public roles, betraying the very uh, spirit of the Irish liberation movements. So these provisions were adopted in the constitution. The interesting thing is that these provisions were adopted in this constitution by a national plebiscite, which implies that majority public opinion went for this reversal, and the idea of a Catholic Irish womanhood actually dominated the public mind, public opinion. And I think we all have read about Partha Chatterjee's nationalist resolution of the women's question. Uh, for India also, he talked about this same trend of a new patriarchy emerging within the very ambit of the nationalist movement, and how that was settling the woman question in the very false essentialism of home and the world, public and the private. So this actually leads us to this very question of how identity, class, religion, race, nationalism,
Uh-huh.
all these play a very important role in the contour of suffrage movement. I would like to give another example from South Africa. Uh, After a long struggle for equal rights on non-racial uh, terms, the South African government uh, granted franchise right to all men with a minimum standard of uh, limit of property. And this was the uh, major law, uh, being the Cape Colony law, known as the Cape Colony law, and that was actually
Apurva sir, please mute yourself, sir.
that actually was followed by other provinces also, the Cape Colony law. Now, the for a suffrage movement with the efforts of the women's suffrage groups and women's enfranchisement association of the union, particularly, they played a very important role. The Cape House Assembly actually granted franchise right to white women on, once again, on property criteria. Now, the interesting thing is that the subsequent laws in other provinces also gradually relaxed the property criteria for women and men, and they of for white women and white men. This property criteria was not relaxed for the black males, keeping the qualification intact for the uh, non-whites. Now, the interesting thing is that while the franchise right was denied to the black woman in this law, or in the subsequent laws as well, which was predicated on racial identity, it served a secondary strategic purpose as well on native question. The Cape Province Law of 1853, it extended the political participation, as I have already mentioned, extended the political participation uh, to the non-white males. And that had the threat of challenging the white supremacy in the legislatures. So, while women saw actually the granting of franchise right to white women served the purpose of creating a balancing political constituency of the whites vis-a-vis the blacks to check the strength of the non-white males in the assembly by the exercise of their franchise rights. So the black leadership protested against this racial law of political disenfranchisement using the woman. So woman was used to disenfranchise the black males as well. The very well-known face of African People's Organization, the movement, and anti-apartheid movement, Dr. Abdullah Rahman. I give a quote from him. He said, fancy the parliament of a civilized country such a low and mean thing as actually dragging their women folk and giving them the vote for the purpose of robbing the native of his vote. So how woman was, and on terms of race, was used as a strategic political constituency vis-a-vis the non-whites. So racial identity subverted the struggle for universal franchise, marked by the politicking of gender in the construction of a women constituency, political constituency, based on predominantly urban, white, educated, English-speaking women. However, it was, I think we should also take note of the thing that the black movement, native black movement, at that time also did not prioritize women's franchise vis-a-vis their movements for social and economic equality. So actually, the South African women of mixed ethnicity and Indians, they got the franchise right in 1984 after a long battle, and only in 1994 in the first democratic constitution under the interim constitution, they got the full right. So this actually showed the very important feature of suffrage politics, interjected by the questions of identity. It becomes a very important question. Now, as I have already mentioned, that the uh, the development, evolution of women as political constituency, uh, not through the suffrage movement, marked the journey towards political empowerment and women's right to vote, to elect and to be elected. That actually was the part of the broader broad fundamental rights, natural rights debates. And this began with, of course, began with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen just after French Revolution, as part of the French Revolution in 1791. And this was the declaration where we saw the proclamation of equal rights for man and woman. And the first right to vote, the first achievement to the women's right to vote was gained only in 1893 in New Zealand. That was the first nation state to give women the voting right, almost after 100 years, more than 100 years. And the first European country to ensure women's franchise right was Finland in 1906. It was only after this 100 years of struggle that women got the formal franchise right, started gaining the franchise rights. Now, I would like to have a very quick a quick profiling of the gender representation in the parliaments, in the legislative bodies. That actually may be termed as the very definite product of these suffrage rights, the demographic profile, how it was changing. And to before doing that, I just like to mention one or two things, that this franchise, the history of this franchise movement, it have very interesting signposts, some very interesting timeline, and Usually we this achievement of women's franchise right, this is history we actually reflects an interesting trend in terms of uh, who gained the franchise right first. And what we find that the early democratic regimes, the early democracies of the West, the liberal regimes, Republican governments, they granted women's right to vote in a progressively slower manner. Whereas the newer democracies, they gaining independence, for example, the post-colonial ones, they granted this right from their founding constitutions. So we can see there was a peak in the graph of women's franchise in the 1940s and 50s because of the decolonization. A large part of African, American, Latin American, Asian women gaining the right to vote. The second important point I would like to mention is uh, women's political right is historically associated with the broader democratic transition from monarchic, oligarchic, or authoritarian systems. Yet, a deeper analysis reflects the exigency of electoral mainstream politics in granting these electoral reforms towards equal franchise in many of these countries. What I actually want to say is that the granting of franchise right was a very significant part of electoral politics and mainstream electoral politics from the very beginning. And the political strategy was not only to extend the right of vote to women, but other sections of population, otherwise disempowered, like lower class men, non-whites, religious minorities, ethnic minorities, etc. And while the suffrage movements swept the streets late 18th century, early 19th century, while it was sowing the streets, it was actually the legislature which was the site of actual reforms, implying who were sitting over there as policymakers. And eventually, they were the male leaders. Now, there have been a lot of archiving of the memoirs of the suffragists, and that evidence a strategic collaboration, uh, lobbying of the women leaders with these male politicians to incentivize their electoral prospects through granting of franchise rights to women. I've already mentioned it in the case of South Africa, that how the white women were granted the right to vote as an incentive to check the influence of the non-whites. Here, I would like to give one example from America, from the uh, very important 19th Amendment of American Constitution in 1980, President Woodrow Wilson, who played a significant role behind the 19th Amendment to uh, grant uh, US women the voting rights. Now, in his younger days, uh, Woodrow Wilson was found to be very found to be very anti-woman in his attitude, in his speeches. When he was a lecturer, he was a professor in a women's college at that time, before being the president. Now, I just give one example of his apathy to the women folk coming to the space of power, public power. Uh, During a Women's Congress meeting held in 1884, uh, he wrote about that meeting that, barring the chilled, scandalized feeling that always overcomes me when I see and hear women speak in public, I derived a